Let's talk about unemployment. Now, I'm hoping this is something that resonates with you all. Given recent events, the number of people filing new unemployment claims has shot through the roof in the last few days, actually. And so understanding what this is, hopefully, is somewhat in your mind. So what is unemployment? Well, it turns out that the unemployment is the portion of the population looking for work but unable to find a job. Or it is, actually, I may stretch this out a little bit and say it is the portion of the labor force who is looking for work and willing to take a job at the prevailing market wage but unable to find one. Now we're going to have to come back and talk about what the labor force is, but the unemployment rate, the number you hear in the news, is going to be the number of people who are categorized as unemployed divided by the total number of people in the labor force. Now, if you listened to Planet Money recently, you will have heard the distinction about people who are actually looking for work, and that is an important piece that we're going to zoom in here. So that's really, it's just a percentage. So if you remember our distinction between percent change, and change, unemployment is a percentage. It is the share of the labor force that is currently not working but willing to take a job and looking for one. So the book has this table. I, of course, like to animate these as much as possible. So we have the number of people who are employed, who have jobs, and we have the number of people who are unemployed, who are actively looking for work and willing to take a job at the prevailing market wage but unable to find one. These two groups combined make the labor force. Now, there are other people who are not in the labor force. Turns out some of them are simply adults not in the labor force. Some of you are not in the labor force. So any of you who are going to school full-time and not working would be adults not in the labor force. Anybody who is so discouraged about the prospects of finding a job, who has moved in with friends or family and is despondent and simply playing Xbox, they would also not be in the labor force. They would be adults not in the labor force. Anybody who's retired. My parents are not in the labor force. They are retired. They do things, but they don't do them as a job. And so these two groups combined would be what we call adult civilian non-institutionalized population. In class, I oftentimes will abbreviate this as ACNIP, the adult civilian non-institutionalized population. So we have adults not in the labor force, and we have the labor force. And the labor force itself splits into the unemployed and the employed. Now, in addition to the ACNIP, the adult civilian non-institutionalized population, we also have, guess what? We have kids, not adults. We have people in the military, not civilian. And we have people who are institutionalized, the institutionalized. Now, institutionalized typically breaks down into people who are in mental institutions and then people who are in jails. Now, the lion's share of that in this country is people who are in prison. They are institutionalized. Now, this is not a judgment call that the military or the institutionalized don't count. Rather, it's saying both labor force participation, which we'll talk about in a moment, and unemployment are really meant to be measures of the extent to which we are productively using the labor that is available to us. In other words, in our sort of big picture institutions to incentives to factors of production output, to what extent are we effectively using labor as a factor of production? We add these two groups together and we end up with the total population. Now, why the heck do we care about unemployment? Why do we care? It's an important question to ask. So you might tell me, hey, the unemployment rate shot up recently. And I go, so why do I care? One reason is that unemployment is immensely difficult psychologically and socially. Turns out it's one of the bigger, if not the biggest predictor of life satisfaction. People who are unemployed really struggle. And it makes sense because in effect, if you are unemployed, what it is saying is you don't have anything to contribute to society, or at least that's where many people take that. Say, look, I would like to work. I'd like to have a job. I'd like to do something productive. I'd like it to be productive enough that people will pay me for it, and I can't find anything to do. That is really traumatic for many people. So that's one reason we should care about this. Right? There's huge implications for self-esteem, for substance abuse, for spousal abuse, for just downright depression. So it's a major source of social ills. And as economists and members of society, we should care about that. Another reason to care about it, however, beyond that, is that unemployment would indicate that we have underutilized factors of production. So in our Solow model, and when I covered that, I mentioned that our model assumes that we are fully utilizing all of our factors of production. Unemployment, in effect, means that we have factors of production that are going unused. And we would possibly be, we would be better off as a society if we could use those factors of production. If you want to think about this, how you would use our model for this, again, this is breaking the formal assumptions of our model, but I'm willing to do it. In effect, what this would do is if you have less labor for every unit of physical capital, then each unit of physical capital, we've already walked through this, should in theory become less productive. In other words, our output capital relationship line would shift down. And of course, along with it, our investment line would shift down because a certain percentage of a smaller amount is a smaller amount. And if you walk through that and actually draw it out, it should indicate that compared to where we would have been with full labor productivity or full labor contribution, we are going to have a lower level of output per capita, and we will have a lower level of economic growth per capita. So it's something we are concerned about. And that's clearly one way to model what is going on in the American economy is currently with the shutdown and the virus is that we have the same number of units of capital, but those units of capital are dramatically less productive as we use less labor. And thus that line shifts down and GDP per capita shifts down and economic growth shifts down. I think that's clearly a nice way of, an appropriate way of using our analytic tools to gain some insight into the current situation. Now, some things that unemployment doesn't do. And as I've already mentioned, and this is sort of where Planet Money's podcast was getting at, it doesn't measure discouraged workers. So if people currently in this environment say, look, there's no frickin' way I'm going to find a job currently, I'm not even going to look. There's the question of practically are they counted as unemployed, but conceptually they don't count as unemployed. They count as discouraged workers. And so it turns out that it is entirely possible for us to be dramatically worse off as a reduction in the unemployment rate. I always, in class, will mention, and I'll mention it here, although you won't be able to, hopefully it will come across as somewhat tongue-in-cheek, that I know how to solve unemployment. I can get rid of unemployment tomorrow. Any ideas how? One way, and this is not my preferred way, but would be to take everybody who is currently unemployed out and shoot them. What would happen? They would no longer be unemployed. The numerator in our unemployment rate calculation would go to zero. Now, is that socially productive? No, it's a terrible thing. Now, the other thing we could do instead of shooting them would be to put them all in jail or to put them all in the military. Does that mean it's a good thing? No, that's also a bad thing. Now, the other thing that would be bad, that's a little bit less extreme than moving people from the adult civilian non-institutionalized population into either not in the population at all or in institutionalized or military occupations, would be for people to stop looking for work, at which point they would be part of the adult civilian non-institutionalized population, but they would not be part of the labor force. So unemployment doesn't measure discouraged workers. It also doesn't measure people who would take a job at a higher wage. You say, look, it's not worth it to me right now to go get a job. It also doesn't measure job satisfaction. It doesn't measure the quality of the job worker match. It doesn't measure full or part-time. So again, if you're employed part-time, you are not counted as unemployed. Now, there are other measures besides the unemployment rate, things like the underemployment rate. The labor utilization rate is what it's sometimes called, and that's a little bit trickier to, right? You have to look into exactly how that's measured. The one I would emphasize is the labor force participation rate, or the LFPR, which we'll talk about in a moment. There's also, we could talk about the number of full-time jobs. We could even talk about the number of full-time jobs per capita or per worker or something like that. We could talk about average wages. We could talk about work week, etc. The unemployment rate, frankly, is not something we really care about. Not on its own. It's a proxy for what we care about. It's a proxy for either underutilized resources in our economy, but it doesn't get fully at that. Or it's also a measure possibly of the people who are looking for work but haven't become so discouraged. And so it turns out if I think about measures that I would care about, unemployment as a measure of well-being in society is almost irrelevant. It may be relevant, but you need so much more information to figure it out, right? As I hopefully illustrated earlier, reducing unemployment to zero by shooting everybody who's unemployed would be a tragedy, and it would be a gross violation of human rights, but it would drive unemployment to zero. So clearly what we care about isn't the unemployment rate. We care about underutilized resources and people who despair of their future. So hopefully that helps you understand what unemployment is and is not. As I'm going to argue later on, seeing an increase in the unemployment rate can be a good thing. Seeing an increase in the unemployment rate can be a bad thing. Seeing a decrease in the unemployment rate can be a good thing or a bad thing. It turns out just looking at the unemployment rate doesn't tell us one way or the other. So just like with GDP and GDP growth, we almost certainly are going to want to triangulate just like we would with GDP. Yes, I repeated myself there, but we can all live with it. So now let's take a moment and talk about the types of unemployment. So types of unemployment, we have 3 types: frictional, structural, and cyclical. Now I'm going to stop this video here and start another one, and maybe you can at least stop for a moment and think about what you think each of those types represents. What do those words conjure up for you? What do you think those might mean?